Good evening, everybody. My name's Ethan Abner. I'm a long-range planner with community planning and permitting. Thanks for joining us this evening for this feedback session on concepts that we're looking at for short-term dwelling and vacation rental update. We'll wait just a few more seconds and then we'll get started. All right. So as I said, thanks for joining us this evening. Just wanted to run through the agenda with you all real quick. During the feedback session, we're going to review some of the concepts that staff have drafted and developed and are considering as part of the short-term dwelling and vacation rental regulation update. First, we'll just identify the concept's intent, and that is essentially what we were trying to achieve with the concept that we were considering. Then I will introduce the concept and provide a brief explanation. We'll host a short question and answer period so that we can try and answer any questions that you have about the particular concept. I would note that some of the concepts are simpler than others, so we may only spend a few minutes on those. Some are a little bit more complex, so we may take a little bit longer time with those. We only have an hour and a half to do this presentation, and we have 9 concepts to get through, so we'll mostly be using Zoom's question and answer feature as well as Zoom's polling feature. If you are interested in asking a question once we get to the Q&A portion for each concept about that concept, all you have to do is type your question into the Q&A box and then click send. And then one of my colleagues will read that question out loud and I'll answer it for you. We'll be moving concept by concept. So when we're on a specific concept, try to stay focused on that one concept. Like I said, we only have a very limited amount of time. Once we've answered as many questions as we can in the time that we have, there will be, like I said, some poll questions that'll pop up on your screen that you can answer. Generally, we're interested in your thoughts on whether the concept we've presented achieves the intent that we've outlined, and if you would support or oppose the concept. There are just generally some limitations with Zoom webinars, and again, the amount of time that we have this evening. So I understand that you may not be able to provide all the feedback that you'd like to provide. If that's the case, at the end, I'm going to provide my email, how you can contact me, as well as a link to the Docket website for this docket, and a link to a feedback form that you can answer if you'd like to provide some more in-depth information or some in-depth perspectives on each concept that we've gone over tonight. With that, we'll just go ahead and get started with a quick introduction. Before I start talking about the concepts, I just wanted to provide you with some brief background. As a result of the short-term and vacation rental 2-year review that we completed back in January, the Board of County Commissioners authorized staff to update the short-term dwelling and vacation rental regulations. The commissioners directed us to explore options that would create more certainty for applicants, streamline the application and review process, and reduce redundancy. Commissioners also asked staff to review information about taxing short-term rentals, addressing neighborhood compatibility, finding booking platforms, etc. The concepts that we're sharing this evening are they're drafted to address the direction that the commissioners provided us, and to better understand how you may feel about some of the things that we're considering. As a reminder, these aren't yet proposed regulations. They're simply concepts that we're thinking about. That's why we're interested in getting your feedback. Although some of them may work together, it may be helpful as you answer some of the polling questions or you ask your own questions about the concepts, if you think about each concept as an individual idea. I would also, just as a reminder, when we talk about updates to the Boulder County Land Use Code, those updates apply to the unincorporated areas of the county, not in cities or towns like Boulder or Longmont. So just to practice, we'll do a quick poll just to familiarize ourselves with the Zoom webinars polling feature. So just to get a sense of who's in the room this evening, which of the following best describes you? There are some options there, as well as which of the following best describes where you currently reside. So we'll leave this poll open for just a little bit, and So it looks like we've almost had most of the participants answer. It seems like we've got a bunch of different folks here, folks who own or manage short-term rentals, people who are interested in applying for a license, people who live in an area where there's a short-term dwelling or vacation rental, and some folks who are outside, who don't own, manage, or live near vacation rental. We've also got quite a few folks from the mountains, a couple from the plains, and some from outside Boulder County. So with that, we'll go ahead and move to the first concept. As I said, I'll introduce it real quick and then provide some information about it, and then we'll move into the question and answer. So the land use code defines uses for primary dwelling short-term rentals, secondary dwelling short-term rentals, and vacation rental categories. Primary dwelling short-term rentals do not require a land use review prior to obtaining a license. Secondary dwelling short-term rentals and vacation rentals must first, before they obtain a license, be approved through a site-specific discretionary review. These rental types also require public hearings with the Planning Commission or the Board of County Commissioners, depending on the type and the location. Secondary dwelling short-term rentals and vacation rentals are approved or denied on a case-by-case basis based on a criteria review. Staff are presenting two options for your consideration. We have option A, which we will discuss first. It eliminates the discretionary review, while option B presents a more simplified land use review process that maintains some discretion during the review. I'll review the two options and then we'll open it up for questions. So in option A, all short-term dwelling and vacation rentals would be handled through licensing only rather than a discretionary review. Staff would develop language prescribing areas where these rental types are appropriate. This could include things like zoning district, geographic location, wildfire risk, and other considerations. Staff would review the rental to ensure that it meets the established parameters. This option, as I said, would remove discretion from staff and neighbors and likely narrows the properties that would be eligible for the short-term dwelling or vacation rental use. This option also removes the ability to apply conditions of approval to specific sites. Immediately adjacent property owners would only receive notice about the short-term dwelling or vacation rental approval after the license is issued and would not be asked to provide input on the proposed use. Referral agencies like public health would still provide comments related to relevant licensing requirements to confirm the rental complies with the regulations. This option substantially reduces the process required when we compare it to the current regulations. And again, just to summarize, it eliminates discretion, it removes the requirement for public hearings, it doesn't allow for neighbors to comment before approval, and it may narrow the number of properties that qualify for rental. Option B is a simplified review process, but differs from option A in the sense that it would maintain some discretion during the review. Again, staff would develop language prescribing areas where the rental types are appropriate, and this could include those things like zoning districts, geographic location, etc. A set of criteria would be evaluated to assess the suitability of each unique site for a rental use on a case-by-case basis. An administrative review of the proposal would be necessary, and a site-specific determination would be made based on an evaluation of the criteria. An administrative review is a review that receives approval from the Director of Community Planning and Permitting, and so this would remove the requirement for a public hearing. This approach allows for notification of adjacent property owners and referral agencies and allows them to comment on the proposed use. This option retains discretion on the appropriateness of the rental, and it also reduces the amount of process required when compared to the current regulations. So now we'll move into the question and answer portion. As I said, you can just enter your question into the Q&A box and then click send, and we'll answer those as they pop up. As a reminder, I've just included a small table that kind of talks about the key differences between option A and option B.
Ethan, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat.
Okay, well, I'll give it just a little bit of time.
Oh, we just had one pop up.
Okay.
Oh, a couple. Okay. Folks are getting going. The first question, is there an appeal process for adjacent neighbors?
In the instance of option A, neighbors wouldn't be able to appeal the license determination. In option B, neighbors would be able to comment, and in some instances, when we talk about this kind of administrative review process, there's an opportunity for once the director issues his determination for members of the public to request an appeal. And so that may be part of option B, but it would likely not exist in option A, the licensing only option.
Thanks. The next question is, why would option A narrow the number of properties that qualify?
So option A could narrow the number of properties that qualify, just because if we're going to take discretion out of the process, we'll likely have very prescriptive regulations about where vacation rentals can be at. And so by virtue of being very prescriptive rather than discretionary in the review, you may exclude, as part of that process, a large number of properties may be excluded. What that looks like now, we don't have, an estimate, just because we haven't come up with all of the prescriptive language that we might consider, but just in general, that's how it might reduce the number of properties that could qualify for a rental under a licensing only regime.
Iona daughter also asked that same question, so hopefully that answer satisfies her. The next question we have, would option B have clearly written and documented criteria for what qualifies as an appropriate location for short-term rental?
Yes. So what we would try to do is reduce discretion as much as we can in either process. Like I said, in the process with licensing only, it might be very prescriptive about where you can have this unit. And then there are other things that may be considered as part of the regulations that could have an impact. In the instance of kind of having a simplified review process where there is some discretion, we would try and be prescriptive about the language that we have, but we may also be able to provide to implement site-specific conditions based off of that specific site's location to make sure that it's appropriate for the use. And so I see, I think that answers that question. And so I see another question here about deciding where STRs would be allowed. Again, that could be done through a number of different things, but thinking about prescriptive language that we might use, considering maybe geographic location, right? For instance, there may be areas that are more appropriate than others. Different areas of the county, just because we have different kind of, we have different things going on. There may be a more traditional use in the mountains versus the plains. We may have more of our traditional housing stock in the plains. And so just considering a variety of different factors to kind of figure out how best to write those regulations to decide where STRs may be the most appropriate and where we may just, by virtue of reducing discretion in the process, exclude them from a particular area.
And just maybe to follow up on that, Ethan, I think that would be sort of a next cut in the development of some revised regulations, is sort of how once we figure out conceptually where we're going, then we would get into the details of looking at sort of what those requirements are and how we spell them out in the code.
Yes. And like I said, there are a lot of things that we are considering, right? We're looking at the current regulations that we have. We're taking a look at what we may already consider, whether or not we want to, how we want to modify that, how we might reduce discretion, where we might introduce more prescriptive language. And so it is a concept at this point, right? We're trying to get a general sense of how people feel about them.
Ethan, there's a question. Why is the reduction of the number of short-term rentals necessary?
So I think we've received guidance from the commissioners that we want to want to keep we want to be responsible about where these vacation rentals or short-term dwelling rentals take place. We want to make sure that the use is appropriate. We definitely want to make sure that there's a public safety component, and a lot of the research that we've looked at in areas throughout Colorado, as well as more broadly, sometimes short-term dwelling rentals do have an impact on housing stock, and so just being mindful of how many you have and where they are can help address some of those issues.
Yeah, and I would add, for this concept in particular, it's not necessarily about reducing the number of rentals. It's the intent behind exploring these options is to consider a different process.
Right. Hopefully a process that's, creates more certainty for homeowners or for folks who are interested in obtaining a rental license, or streamlining it a little bit.
Let's see. Question, Ethan, is currently most unincorporated Boulder County does not allow any accessory dwelling units or accessory structures where people can sleep. Would this change in the approval process open up more zone districts where short-term rentals would be allowed in secondary structures?
Probably not at this time.
Would both options still retain the primary dwelling license? If so, is there any intent that the property owner actually live on the property?
So that is a good question. We are looking at maintaining, in some sense, one of the things that we're looking at is the primary dwelling short-term rental license. And there is a concept that we'll talk about later that talks about occupancy versus residency. So we'll hopefully get to that question later. I'll try and keep it in the back of my mind when we get there. And I would just note that we'll need to move along here shortly. So any last call for questions, and then we'll open up the poll and see what responses we get. But I do appreciate all the questions. Thank you for the participation.
The last question that maybe on this concept, Ethan, that we haven't discussed at all yet is, what would neighborhood compatibility look like?
So that's one of the things. So that's one of the things that we're trying to work through with these two concepts, or these two options, as we consider this first concept is process related, reducing the amount of discretion and streamlining. Right. As part of that, we would have to draft prescriptive language. And since this is a concept, we're currently thinking about what that language might look like. How do we, reduce the impacts to neighborhood compatibility? Or how do we better assess neighborhood compatibility? How do we reduce impacts to neighbors? And there are a couple of concepts that could reduce impacts. But like I said, at this point in time, we're still working through some of that. And so if that's the last question, we'll go ahead and open up the poll.
We have one last question that relates to about primary residences again, but I think maybe when we get to that section, we'll answer that question.
Okay.
So I would go ahead and answer the poll.
All right, so the poll is up. There are 3 questions there. We'll just give you a moment to take some time and respond. So the changes in processes, I see a question that just popped up in the chat, and I'll answer it while folks are answering the poll. But the changes in processes would most likely have the most, some parts of the primary dwelling short-term rental process could change, but the most impact that you would see are the other 2 rental types that we have. that are focused on non-primary residences. And we'll just give a couple more seconds for the poll. Got a pretty even split here from what I can see. Some folks prefer option A, some option B. Some don't prefer either. Like I said, I'll give you a link to a feedback form at the end if you'd like to provide some additional feedback on that point. All right. So we'll move on to the next concept. Like I said, I appreciate you participating. The second kind of concept that we're going to talk about are licensing caps. And so licensing caps, or a cap on the number of licenses that we have available, they could address concerns related to neighborhood impacts, housing stocking, and housing affordability. A cap on the licenses available could, better limit impacts to housing stock and housing affordability over time. They can also help ensure that the number of short-term dwelling and vacation rentals in a defined area are appropriate from the community's perspective. As I mentioned in the last question, we may have different areas of the county where these may be more or less appropriate, different types may be more or less appropriate. This cap that we're talking about here would not be the same as the current limitation that we have of one license of any type for any rental. And so just to try and provide some additional, to an example, I've got a slide that shows Steamboat Springs zone overlays map for their short-term rentals. Again, this is just an example to generally show you what a geographic kind of concept looks like. Like I said, this is from Steamboat Springs. It's helpful for explaining how the licensing caps work. The zone overlay map, which you can see on the right side of the screen, consists of 3 zones. In the green zones that you see on the map, there's no limit on the number of short-term rental units. In the yellow zones, there are restrictions on the number of units allowed, as well as some caps. And in the red areas, short-term dwelling or vacation rentals might be outright prohibited. And so again, this is just one kind of real-world example of how some communities implement geographic licensing caps, how they consider geography as part of that, how they may consider traditional use. Other communities, this isn't the only thing that we're considering, right? Other communities have established county-wide limits with a specific percentage that's available, while others have looked at specific census tracts. So there are a couple of different ways to maybe do this with a geographic component, and we're exploring a variety of those. And so again, we'll move into the question and answer portion. If you have any questions, please feel free to submit them. You just type them in and press send. And then after we get some of those answered, we'll move on to the poll. And each time we stop to do one of these question and answer sessions, I understand that it may take some time to type some things out. So I'll give folks about a minute to do that. And then if we don't see anything, we can move on.
Ethan, it's not a question, but we have a comment from Richard Harris that says it might be a help with somebody else giving that a thumbs up. Richard, you are typing in the right place. And we have a question that is, have you considered capping the number of short-term rentals by owner rather than an area or a percentage? As in, one person can only own X number of rentals regardless of location.
So that's actually currently a requirement in our existing licensing ordinance, and it's something that, we're reviewing the entire licensing ordinance, which we'll talk about in the next concept. But we're reviewing the entire licensing ordinance, and right now, the way it works, there is one license available of any type to any person or associated entity or anything like that. And so, yes, right now there is a limit, and that is the case.
I think that's the end of questions for this one.
Okay, well, there should be a poll up on your screen for number 2, the caps on the number of licenses available. If you take just a moment to read those and answer, we'll give you a little bit of time, and then we can move on to the next concept. All right, so we'll go ahead and close that poll, and then we'll move on to the third concept. This one should be fairly simple, I think. So as I mentioned just a second ago, we're reviewing the licensing ordinance that we have, as well as the land use code requirements, to see if there's anything that we can refine or remove, because we want to ensure that the requirements that we have in the license are clear and that they serve a defined purpose. So like I said, we're going through the entire licensing ordinance, but some of the things that we're looking at, some of the things that came up during the 2-year review and our discussions at that public hearing with the commissioners, were taking a look at our home energy rating system requirements, our parking requirements, how access works, radon testing, and some other requirements. And so we're in the process of doing that. But there's one specific requirement that I think would be helpful to have some specific feedback on. It's related to the Wildfire Partners assessment and certification requirement. So currently, primary dwelling short-term rentals and secondary dwelling short-term rental applicants have to complete a Wildfire Partners assessment before they receive a license. And during an assessment, what happens is our Wildfire Partner staff go out to the property and review it with the owner. And they provide some recommendations about wildfire mitigation activities. They give the owner a stoplight chart that says, this is good, you need to work on this, things like that. Vacation rental applicants, however, they have to complete Wildfire Partner certification, which requires full implementation of the assessment directives before they can receive a license. And so staff are considering modifying the regulations to require Wildfire Partners assessments for all rental types at the licensing application. That means that primary dwelling short-term rentals, secondary dwelling short-term rentals, and vacation rentals would all need to get an assessment when they apply for their license, or have an assessment by the time they apply for their license. And then certification when they get a licensing renewal, which typically occurs 2 years after the receipt of the license. And so we think that this could create parity among the applicants and allow licensees 2 years to complete their mitigation activities before they get their certification. And just in general, Wildfire Partners has also suggested a recertification for license holders every 6 years. So we'll move into the questions and answers real quick. As always, if you'd like to ask a question, just type it in the box, click send. And then after that, we'll move to the polls.
No questions here yet, Ethan.
Okay. We'll give it about 15 more seconds. Just so everyone's aware, I'm only working with 2 screens here, so it's hard for me to see the question and answer boxes. And so that's why I'm, relying on
Ethan, we do have some comments in the chat.
Okay.
If you want, I can.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Will the county have enough gumption to deny rentals already allowed?
I mean, I would say that, when a rental goes to get their, however the process ends up, if a rental conforms with the requirements, then, if they qualify to receive a license and they're approved, then they would receive a license.
The next is that they don't think primary residence short-term rentals should have the same constraints as secondary rentals, and that people should be able to rent their house out when they are gone to help pay their mortgage without having to pay for expensive upgrades. The other comment is how would delaying training and certification prevent fires 2 years after licensing?
So we're not necessarily delaying training and certification. We're just introducing parity to all rental types. So everybody would have to receive an assessment, which means that everybody would have to go through the Wildfire Partners assessment process. And again, that's where they get those information about some of the strategies that they should implement in order to reduce hazards from wildfires. And then in order to receive their license, to renew their license, they would have to implement those certification requirements. So we're not really delaying anything. We're giving folks the opportunity, the time. It would be giving folks the opportunity or time to implement some of those mitigation strategies.
Thanks. I think that clears the comments.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and put the poll up. Again, number 3, removing and refining licensing requirements. We'll give you just a little bit of time to answer that. Then we'll move on to the next concept. So we'll leave the poll open for about 15 more seconds, and then we'll close it and move on to the next concept for those folks who still need time to answer. All right. So concept number 4 is related to minimum night rental periods. Minimum night rental periods can help establish a predictable level of use for the community and minimize impacts to the surrounding area. Currently, minimum night rental periods, something like the unit must be rented for 2 nights minimum, are only required by the land use code for secondary dwelling short-term rentals. Although not required for vacation rentals, minimum night rental periods are sometimes included as a condition of approval in order to reduce the intensity of the use by reducing a unit's rate of turnover. And so staff are considering, we're thinking about a minimum night rental period for all short-term dwelling rentals and vacation rental types, since these provisions could ensure a more predictable level of use for the community. And so, simple enough. We'll move right into the Q&A. We'll give folks a little bit of time to type something in.
We've got a few questions coming in. The first of which is, does this question apply to primary dwelling unit short-term rentals as well as secondary?
It could apply to all rental types. Like I said, these are some concepts, and as we go through, we may determine that yes, it should, or we may, or that might be our recommendation that yes, it should, or we might look and there may be an assessment that it should be different for different types. But in general, it may be something that we consider for all rental types.
Next question is, what impact would this change have on the concept of limiting the number of licenses? I presume that's referring to the licensing cap concept.
So like I said, these are all just some concepts, and they may work together. But just for the purpose of trying to, stay focused on the actual merit of the individual concept, rather than get into how this might function with a licensing cap or something else. I think just think about how minimum night rental periods might work in general. And it's possible, like I said, we're still going through the process of getting feedback, and then we'll draft the regulations. But it's possible that there may be some interplay there. And so it's hard to say at this point in time, since it's only a concept, how those two things would impact one another.
The next question is to ask you again to explain the reasoning behind a minimum night stay. So what is the reason for a minimum stay?
So like I said, just minimum night stays can help folks in the surrounding area of a short-term rental understand what, for instance, if you have a 2-night minimum rental period, you'll know that if there are going to be folks there who are renting the unit, they're going to be there for a minimum of 2 nights. And that can reduce turnover, right? Because somebody's not coming in one day and then leaving the next, and then coming in one day and leaving the next. So just by having those requirements in place, you can reduce the amount of turnover that a unit has, which may reduce the impacts on a neighborhood or a surrounding area.
We have some comments, so I'm going to skip to the next question, which is, if a minimum night requirement is implemented, how would this be monitored and ensure that it's being followed?
So it can be difficult to monitor minimum night rental periods to make sure that they're required. Currently, our licensing ordinance does require folks to put in the information about a minimum night rental period if it's required as part of their application, and you might see that remain. We also contract with a third-party vendor who helps us monitor unlicensed short-term rentals, and so we would still consider ways to ensure that folks are renting their approved units in accordance with their approval and the regulations.
The next question is, what minimum is being considered?
So I would say right now, a 2-night minimum is a good place to start, just because that's what we see for a short-term dwelling rental. Though, we may as staff discuss other options.
Okay, and then we've got one more comment. So that's the end of the questions.
Okay. we'll go ahead and open up that poll again. I appreciate you all taking the time to participate. We'll give it about 1 minute and 30 seconds for folks to respond, and then we'll move on to the next concept. All right, so we've had about 80% of the folks respond. We'll go ahead and we'll move on to the next concept. And so concept number 5, again, thinking about limiting the total number of nights per year could also help establish a predictable level of use for the community and minimize the impacts to the surrounding area. Currently, the code does not establish a limit on the total nights per year that a primary dwelling short-term rental or a vacation rental can be rented. However, the total nights per year that a dwelling can be rented is sometimes included as a condition of approval for vacation rentals that undergo that discretionary review. The code does limit secondary dwelling short-term rentals to 60 nights per year to allow owners of a dwelling that's not their primary residence the opportunity to earn some additional income. But limiting the total number of rental days per year could minimize the impacts that a short-term dwelling or vacation rental has on the surrounding area. So just broadly thinking, let's think about this as 2 options. Option A, should we consider including an explicit limitation for short-term dwelling and vacation rentals? So something in the code or licensing ordinance that says it shouldn't be rented for no more than 180 days a year. That's just an example number, right? And then option B, do not establish a specific limitation on total nights per year. So we'll move to the Q&A real quick. We'll give folks a minute to ask. And then after that, as a reminder, here are the 2 options. We'll give folks an opportunity to ask some questions, and then we'll move on again to the poll. And just so you all know, by participating in the poll, we get the responses, and then I'll have those recorded. And so it gives us something to look back on. And so, it's just so that you're aware.
And Ethan, maybe just to follow that, the comments that we're getting in the Q&A are not something that we can really record anywhere, which is why we're really asking that if you have comments that you want to provide, we do want to hear them, and there's a feedback form that Ethan's gonna give you more direction about later. So far, we have a comment, but no questions. There's a question about making changes to the upcoming polls, which the polls are already designed in Zoom at this point in time. If you want to provide that distinguishment in your comments in response to the feedback form, that's a good place to do that.
Are there any questions?
There is a question about whether the county is considered the economic consequences to owners in the communities if these severe restrictions are implemented?
So I would say in general, yes, part of this feedback session is to hear folks' comments or, their concerns or their questions about the concepts that, again, are just concepts that we're exploring. But in general, when we think about the short-term dwelling and vacation rental regulations, we look at some of the goals that we have in our comp plan about housing affordability and housing stock, as well as, creating some economic opportunity for folks. So I think that is something that we will consider as we move through the process of drafting regulations. But again, we're just talking about broad concepts to try and get a sense of some feedback on that. So the poll is on your screen. Again, we'll give folks a little bit of time to answer those questions. And then after about 1 minute and 30 seconds, we'll move on to the next concept. All right, we'll leave the poll open just for a few more seconds, and then we'll move on to the next concept. And so the sixth concept, thinking about it in a different way, providing a limited number of bookings that might help establish a predictable level of use for the community and minimize impacts to the surrounding area. Some communities have provided short-term dwelling and vacation rental owners with an allotment of bookings to use at their discretion. And this can give owners the flexibility to determine when to rent their units and how to best utilize their allotment of bookings. Once a booking allotment is given to an owner and then it's used, if it's exhausted, they would be unable to rent the property until a new allotment period begins. So just as an example, at the start of the new year, this particular method might incentivize owners to prefer a longer minimum night rental period and limit the total number of nights per year that a property is rented, which could reduce impacts on the surrounding area. As part of this, owners of short-term dwelling and vacation rentals would need to provide annual reports to the county regarding how the booking allotment is used, but that could be something as simple as, I used this booking it was this long between these dates, right? And so just as a general concept, we'll move into questions. Again, rental owners would be given the discretion to use their allotment as they please, and some flexibility there. So we'll allow for some questions and we'll do some answers and again, move into the polling.
Ethan, there's a question about how the allotment would be determined.
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of different things. Again, just a general concept. A couple of different things that we might consider. We might take a look at how many days we allow right now for certain rental types, and then we might, just consider do some looking to see what the appropriate allotment might be. But yes, it would be something that the county determines. But once that's determined, right, and the owner chooses to use their allotment, they can use it however, they might, with some, they might be able to rent for one period of time of 3 days, and that's one booking. And then they might be able to rent for 5 days, and that's a second booking, right? So it gives them some flexibility on when and how they rent.
A question, who would be administering and enforcing all of this?
It would be various departments and community planning and permitting.
And then there's a comment that's not really a question. There's a question, why is the county looking to limit short-term rentals at all? And we might just pause here and talk about this a little bit. The intent of this set of code revisions is really to focus in on the direction that we got after the 3-year review. All of these ideas are to address those various intents that Ethan outlined at the beginning of this presentation. I don't think limiting short-term rentals is a primary goal. We're exploring ways to simplify the process. And if we are simplifying the process, and removing some of the discretion that folks seem to favor, we need to address some, or perhaps add some other elements in the code around creating some consistency and some understanding in the community about the level of use of these things, so we don't have to look at them on a case-by-case basis. So these various concepts that we're looking at are different ways to maybe replace a discretionary review with something that's more clear in the code.
Very helpful, Hannah. Are there any more questions?
There is one, which is what discretionary factors would the county use to determine the allotment?
Like I said, there are a couple of, again, it's a general concept, but there are a couple of things that we could consider. If you have any recommendations, once I give my email at the end, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll add it to, my list of things to think about. So with that, we'll move into the Q&A portion, or the polling portion, sorry. Give folks just a little bit of time to respond, and then we'll move on to the next concept. So we'll give it about 10 more seconds, and then we'll move on. All right. As I said at the beginning, there are only 9 concepts, so we're getting closer to the end. Again, I appreciate you all taking the time to be here tonight. But it came up kind of at the beginning, occupancy. And so concept number 7, occupancy requirements, again, something we're just considering. The intent of this would be to better align the primary dwelling short-term rentals with their original intent. So the current regulations differentiate between short-term dwelling rentals and vacation rentals by determining whether the dwelling in which a short-term or vacation rental is operating qualifies as a primary residence, which is defined in the licensing ordinance. The regulations don't currently specify if the dwelling has to be actually occupied by the owners when the rental is occurring. And so staff are, again, thinking about modifications to the regulations that differentiate between rental types by focusing on occupancy. The current regulations for a primary dwelling short-term rental license were intended to allow residents to kind of get supplemental income by renting unoccupied rooms in their home. The regulations were also kind of drafted on the basis that most safety and neighborhood impact related concerns might be alleviated by having an owner present at the property. And focusing on occupancy rather than residency status would reduce concerns related to housing stock since the dwelling, or could reduce concerns related to housing stock since the dwelling would be occupied by an individual who lives in the community. And so again, when we drafted these regulations, there's currently no land use review or approval. No land use review is required for the primary dwelling short-term rentals because of these kind of presumptions that we had. As part of this, we're also kind of thinking about considering regulations that might allow a primary dwelling short-term rental, if we do talk about occupancy, to be occupied by a long-term occupant, someone who might be a long-term renter, rather than the property's owner. In this scenario, an owner might partner with a long-term occupant to rent a portion of the home as the primary dwelling short-term rental, which could generate income for both parties. Again, it's kind of a general concept. Both parties would need to agree to this arrangement, but it could allow supplemental income for both a renter and an owner, and for an owner to have a license in an instance where the property is not or the owner is not typically present at the property. So with that, we'll move into the Q&A. Again, just type in your questions in the box and click send.
Ethan, we have a question. How does this apply to primary dwellings that the owner wants to rent out for, say, the 2 weeks while they go on vacation?
So that's something that we would still have to think through, whether or not it's strictly focused on occupancy or if there is some sort of aspect there that that might, allow someone to be temporarily gone and rent out their primary residence. We don't have, again, since it's a general concept, we haven't determined an exact way that would work, but there are a couple of different ways to kind of think about that issue. And it could end up resulting in the fact that, yes, you may be able to do that in some circumstances, or no, you may not be able to do that in some circumstances.
There was a question to explain what you mean by no approval. It says,
I think it's just a typo. My apologies. A primary dwelling short-term rental still requires a license in our current system, but there's no land use approval, land use review, or land use approval for a primary dwelling short-term rentals.
what is the current status for owners wanting to rent their residence while they are away?
In some instances, currently, owners might qualify for a primary dwelling short-term rental if it's their primary residence, which is defined in the licensing ordinance. So if you have questions about that, I would recommend visiting the Boulder County website and going through that process. In other instances, owners have secondary dwelling short-term rental licenses or vacation rental licenses. And really, it all just depends on the property status as a residence.
Thanks. The next question is, how does the occupancy requirement square with the definition of primary residence, which does not require continuous residency by the owner?
So that's kind of the point. Right now, the code doesn't require, or the licensing ordinance doesn't require a primary dwelling short-term rental license premises to be occupied. And so if occupancy were the focus rather than primary residency, you would likely see some changes, shifting more towards a focus on occupancy and less of a focus on residency status.
The question is, are you suggesting a long-term renter must live in a primary dwelling to be able to rent a room while the owner is gone?
I'm not, so if I understand the question correctly, someone's asking if the unit would need to be continually occupied in order for an extra space to be rented out of the home. And I think it's easiest to think about it in kind of we are obviously considering these kind of gray areas where someone might be out of town for a weekend, right? But in an occupancy instance, in most instances, the unit would have to be occupied in some way, shape, or form. And as opposed to right now where we don't really focus on occupancy.
Which I think is the point of the second. There are a couple of comments, but I think that's what Chris Batti is speaking to in the comment. But again, we're going to focus on the questions. How could the long-term renter have the same responsibility and liability issues as the owner?
I don't have a good answer to that question. That's something I'll have to look into.
Again, the question about enforcement, how would we enforce occupancy requirements?
Through our typical enforcement processes. We do require currently, and we do define an occupancy limitation based off of bedrooms or septic size, and we would probably continue to do that or something similar.
Right, and I agree that it's a good point for everything that we sort of write in here. How we implement it is always a question that we're asking ourselves as well. And I don't know that we have that sorted out for all the concepts we're considering right this moment. Richard entered a comment about building size and water and sewer that I don't know that I can't interpret what that question is about. And one that is that more like a B&B?
It could be I mean, by the code's definition currently, no, because bed and breakfast requires that a meal be served. I don't think that would necessarily be the case in this instance. So we'll open up the poll, give you some time to respond, and then we'll move on to the 8th concept. All right, we'll give it about 15 more seconds and then we'll close that poll and we'll move on to the next concept. So concept number 8, taxing short-term dwelling and vacation rentals. The intent here is to kind of reduce the disparities among tourism-related businesses, things like hotels and short-term rentals, potentially utilize the funds to address some of the impacts. Colorado law currently allows the county to levy or consider a 2% tax on short-term and vacation rentals. And the law was changed so that the revenue received from this lodging tax can be used for housing and childcare for the tourism-related workforce, seasonal workers, and other workers in the community. at least 10% of the revenue has to be utilized for tourism marketing and promotion. And implementing a tax like this would require voter approval and may be subject to Tabor. It's fairly simple. I'll allow for some questions and answers, and then we'll move on to the poll.
No questions at this time, Ethan.
Okay, if we want to go ahead and open the poll, I think we can do that. Give you about 45 more seconds to answer if you haven't answered already. All right, we'll go ahead and end that poll. We'll move on to the last concept. Concept number 9 is related to enforcement. And so trying to, ensure that all operators are held to the same standard of operation. Currently, the licensing ordinance that we have for short-term dwelling and vacation rentals allows the county to fine owners who don't comply with the regulations. Some other communities have also implemented regulations that create fines for those booking platforms like Airbnb or VRBO or HomeAway, et cetera, that advertise unlicensed short-term dwelling or vacation rentals. So we're considering, just as a general idea, something like this in the county. I'll allow for some quick questions on that, and then give some folks some time to type those in. And then if not, we'll move on to the poll. Get your feedback on those. It should be about as simple as the taxing question, and then we'll move into the conclusion of our feedback session here.
Ethan, there's a question regarding if the county finds other types of licensed entities. I think perhaps for any of the other folks that we license, are there fines for violation?
I think Kathy's here. She may be able to better answer that question than I can, but I'm fairly certain that.
Sorry, yeah, this is Kathy. Yes, we do find other types of licenses.
Okay. Thanks, Kathy.
Ethan, there's a question about whether the booking platform would have access to our licensing database. How would they ensure people don't put down a false number? Additional question, what is the time delay on license approvals and uploading it to the database? So a overall implementation question.
Yeah, those are some good questions. If this were something that was ultimately desired by, if this was something that came out of the process, then we'd have to have a couple of ways to address those sorts of concerns. I don't have a good answer for you on that right now, but that's obviously something that we would have to think about as we think about implementation. Are there any other questions in the chat?
No.
Okay, we'll go ahead and move into that poll. If there are any remaining questions about that active enforcement component or that enforcement component, please feel free to ask them. I'll try and answer them before the poll ends. But other than that, this is the last concept, and then we'll move into the conclusion. All right. So real quick, again, I can't thank you all enough. I appreciate you taking the time to spend over an hour with us this evening to talk about these sorts of things and provide your feedback. As I kind of acknowledged in the beginning, it may not be, you may not be able to provide as much feedback as you have liked. And so here are a couple of pieces of additional information for you. If you have your phone handy or you're not using your phone right now to view the Zoom webinar, you can scan this QR code and it will take you to the feedback form that we have online. It is a longer version of what we just went through with some opportunities to answer some open-ended questions. So feel free to fill that out. If you need the link is right there on the page, as well as the Docket website for this specific docket. You can reach out to me at eabner@bouldercounty.org via email, and I'm happy to try and answer your questions for you or provide some additional information if there was something I wasn't able to get to tonight. Rick, if you're able to, can you post some of these links in the chat or someone else who's acting as a panelist or a co-host? I think we do that sometimes. So. So that should be in the chat for you, at least based off of what I can see on my screens. Like I said, it's got two screens going here. I'm trying to do my best to navigate between things. So next steps. This was a Zoom webinar that we had this evening. We have 2 in-person meetings coming up. It's essentially the same thing. It may vary just a little bit different, but it's essentially the same thing. We're going to be having a feedback session. One is in Allens Park next week, and the other is in the Board of County Commissioners hearing room 2 weeks from now. Information about those events is on the Docket website, so you can go there if you're interested in attending. We'll be up there. Like I said, essentially doing the same thing. Throughout June, staff are going to work on drafting the regulations, and then once we have a finalized draft, the regulations will be posted for public comment. We will host a meeting to kind of explain the regulations that we're recommending, answer any questions that folks have, and provide information on how to comment on those regulations once they're posted online. We're trying to go to Planning Commission in August. As part of that, there's a public hearing, so the public will once again be able to comment. And then Board of County Commissioners after Planning Commission, currently looking at sometime in autumn. It all just depends on what happens with the Planning Commission meeting. Again, I cannot thank you all enough. I do appreciate you taking time to participate. This is helpful. If you do want to reach out to me, like I said, my email address is in the chat. It's eabner@bouldercounty.org, and we'll do our best to kind of answer some of your questions. With that, I guess we can go ahead and sign off, unless there are any questions in the Q&A about next steps.
No questions about next steps.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. And thank you to all the other folks at Boulder County who are here this evening to kind of help and support us. So I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening.